There are many emperors of the Roman Empire who were neglected for a long time and whose importance was only understood quite recently, after centuries of reflecting upon the history of Rome. Many such underrated Roman emperors come quickly to mind, such as the legendary Aurelian or the heroic Emperor Maiorianus. And one of those heroic Roman emperors who gets far too little recognition is the Emperor Maurice. This emperor almost single-handedly saved the Roman Empire, but then something so terrible happened that it would not only cost him and his family his life, but also bring the Roman Empire to the brink of total collapse. It was in the time when the Roman Empire had seen one of the most miraculous expansions of its entire history. The Emperor Justinian had reconquered many of the lost provinces of the former Western Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire stretched once again from the Strait of Gibraltar in the west to the deserts of Egypt and to Armenia, as in the old days of Augustus and Caesar. It looked as if the star of the Romans was on the rise again. During the reign of the Emperor Justinian himself, a boy was born in the year 539 in the city of Arabissus in Cappadocia, and this boy would later become the Emperor Maurice. Not much is known about Maurice's early life, but we can assume that he made some form of state career in the Roman Empire during the reigns of Justinian and later of the Emperor Justin II, and certainly was known to the emperors at some point. In the late reign of the Emperor Justin II in 577, Maurice was appointed to the rank of Magister Militum per Orientem, Supreme General of the Oriental Roman troops, when he was 38 years old, and this despite a total lack of military experience, for it appears that Maurice had only held civil offices before. But only 1 year later, in 578, the war with the eternal enemy in the east flamed up again, and the inexperienced Maurice was forced to fight. Persian raids occurred in Mesopotamia, and the new Magister Militum of the East launched attacks on both sides of the Tigris River. In the following years, Maurice could achieve some impressive victories with Rome's Arab allies, the Ghassanids, as this Arabian tribe was also at war with Persia and with its allies. Maurice came so close to sacking Ctesiphon itself, the capital of the Persians, something which by this time had not been achieved in 282 years. It would have been a giant victory for the Romans, but alas, Maurice had to abort the operation and retreat because the Persians were attacking Roman supply lines and because a destroyed bridge over the Euphrates River was hindering the Roman advance. But in June of 582, Maurice scored another victory on the Eastern Front against the Persians, with the supreme Persian general barely surviving. We thus see how impressive Maurice's track record was, despite not having had previous military experience when taking up his position of Magister Militum in 577. And of course, the then reigning Emperor Tiberius II certainly took notice. That is why when the emperor was struck down by a sickness, he initially named two successors. Yes, two emperors should govern the empire as in the old days, one in the east and one in the west. Germanus was to rule the western provinces from Rome itself, from the Eternal City, which by that time was in pretty bad shape, but which would be restored and made a great capital again. And Maurice was to rule the eastern provinces from Constantinople. It is fascinating that even as late as 600, it was contemplated to rule the empire again with two emperors that would, as in the old days, reign their respective halves of the empire from Rome in the west and from Constantinople in the east. How exactly this could have developed and what consequences this might have had, we shall of course discuss in another video. But alas, Germanus declined, officially out of humility, but probably more because he knew that being emperor was possibly the most dangerous job on the planet, and so Maurice became sole emperor of the Roman Empire in the year 582, 609 years after Augustus had created this highest office of the Roman Empire, and 1362 years after the founding of Rome. He was crowned emperor at Constantinople, the splendorous and magnificent capital of the Roman Empire, which in 582 AD must have been an utterly impressive city with 500,000 inhabitants and many impressive monuments, fora, and other spectacular imperial buildings from hundreds of years, all of which were still standing unspoiled in those days. And if you are a Rome nerd like me, and chances are pretty high that you are if you are watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can get a 10% rebate on every purchase if you type in the rebate code Maiorianus. So go and check out their assortment, it's really quite incredible. So back to the Emperor Maurice. You might have noticed that I haven't said Byzantine Empire a single time in this video. And this is on purpose, since even though Maurice was the first confirmed native Greek speaker as emperor, Latin was still the official state and administrative language of the empire and of the army, and most of the old offices and administrative structures of the Roman Empire were still completely intact, as was the Roman infrastructure and many of the cities themselves. So this empire here was the Roman Empire of old, even though some of the old provinces had still not been recovered from the Germanic tribes, who by now had already long established kingdoms of their own. Maurice, possibly inspired by the plan of his predecessor Tiberius to split the empire again into an eastern and a western half, created the Exarchate of Italy in 584 and the Exarchate of Africa in 591. These regions would be governed by two respective exarchs, one at Ravenna and the other at Carthage. The two exarchs would enjoy great autonomy from Constantinople and were basically the viceroys of the emperor, combining in their office the military authority of a magister militum and the civil authority of a praetorian prefect. It was probably this creation of the Exarchate of Italy that slowed down the Lombard advance, another great achievement of Maurice. But new problems were brewing for the Romans. Not long after Maurice had been fighting the Persians in the east, the Slavs and the Avars had broken through the border defenses and overran the Balkans. In 584, the Slavs came dangerously close to Constantinople itself, and in 586, the Avars besieged the magnificent city of Thessalonica. The Slavs and Avars settled in many parts of the Western Balkans. But the war in Persia was still not over, and so Maurice had to continue fighting in the east. It was not until 591, almost a decade after Maurice had been made emperor, that finally peace was achieved with Persia. Maurice had helped Prince Khosrow II to become the new Persian king, marching with a 35,000 strong combined Roman and Persian army and winning a decisive victory over the enemies of Khosrow. And thus was Khosrow II made new king of the Persians and even adopted by Maurice. And so a very strong alliance had been established and peace was finally achieved in 591. The Roman Empire grew significantly in the east, gaining western Armenia, including the large cities of Martyropolis, Tigranokert, Manzikert, Ani and Yerevan from Persia. Maurice's treaty brought a new status quo to the east territorially, and the Roman Empire was enlarged to an extent in the east not seen in hundreds of years. During this new perpetual peace, millions of solidi were saved for the Roman Empire by not having to buy peace from the Persians. And thus finally in 591, Maurice could turn his attention to the Balkans. While Mauricius was campaigning, his son Theodosius, who had been made co-emperor in 590, was managing things in Constantinople. Maurice arrived in the Balkans with his troops in 592 and took the city of Singidunum back from the Avars. In 593, Priscus, a general of Maurice, achieved victory against the Slavs, Avars and Gepids south of the Danube. In the same year, he crossed the Danube into modern-day Romania and achieved more victories for the empire. In 594, Maurice replaced Priscus with his inexperienced brother Peter, who, despite initial failures, achieved a victory in this former Roman province of Dacia. Priscus, leading another army in the northwestern Balkans, defeated the Avars again in 595, weakening them so much that they would only sporadically attack in Dalmatia 2 years later. In 598, Maurice broke a peace treaty with the Avar leader Bayan I, allowing for a retaliatory campaign into the Avar homeland across the Danube. In 599 and 601, the Roman forces wreaked havoc among the Avars and the Gepids. In 602, the Slavs suffered a major defeat in Wallachia, enabling the Roman troops to regain control of the Danube line. And hence, Maurice was the first emperor since the days of Aurelian or Constantine to successfully campaign across the Danube River, almost like a second Trajan. Maurice also planned to repopulate the areas in the Balkans that had been devastated by the Slavs and the Avars, with Armenian settlers, and to continue campaigns against the Avar Khaganate to either destroy them once and for all, or to force them into submission. And so if we take a snapshot of the Roman Empire in 602, we could think that the star of the Romans was on the rise again. After decades of war with Persia, after the plague of Justinian, after the brutal Gothic Wars, we could think that Maurice would become a second Justinian and Belisarius merged into one person. We would think that next, after the complete defeat of the Slavs and Avars, the Lombards would be defeated, and then maybe the province of Spania would finally be fully reconquered from the Visigoths. But alas, it was not to be. Maurice was a very intelligent and capable emperor, and as we saw, very skilled on the battlefield. He had achieved great victories against the Persians and against the Slavs and the Avars. He had secured a strong peace with Persia, and his adoptive son was now king of the Sassanid Empire, securing the eastern provinces in a way not having been thought possible. But while Maurice was very skilled on the battlefield, having even written a book on the art of war, the Strategikon, which still is counted as one of the best manuals of war ever written, he apparently was not very skilled in judging people around him. While his victories were great, his fiscal policies and treatment of the army were not. The wars were costly, and so he had to implement some very unpopular measures. The taxes were high, and he saved money wherever he could. And in 588, he had even announced a cut of military wages by a quarter. This, of course, immediately sparked rebellions by many of the Roman troops. In 599 or 600, he went even further, refusing to pay a ransom for 12,000 Roman soldiers that had been taken prisoners by the Avars. A military delegation was sent to Constantinople, headed by an officer named Phocas, but the delegation was rejected by the emperor and sent back in an ungracious way, and so the prisoners were killed by the Avars, which understandably caused great outrage within the ranks of the army. And then his final error of judgment came in 602, when he ordered his army that was fighting against the Avars beyond the Danube River in the former province of Dacia to stay overwinter across the Danube. It was then that the troops mutinied against the emperor, and this certainly also had something to do with the wage cuts. And so Phocas, the same Phocas that had been at the head of the embassy to implore the emperor to pay the ransom for the captured soldiers, was proclaimed new emperor by the Roman troops across the Danube. Promptly the troops marched on Constantinople in late 602 and captured the city and the emperor and his family. And then, on November 27, 602, Maurice and his 5 sons were brutally executed by Phocas, who turned out to be a really insane person with certainly psychopathic tendencies, as he forced Maurice to first watch his 5 sons being executed before executing him. His eldest son Theodosius was captured and executed not long afterwards, as were his daughters only a few years later. The utter brutality and evil of Phocas and the disastrous consequences which his reign would have on the Roman Empire will be of course a topic for a future video. Indeed, it was this year of 602 which would mark a gigantic turning point for the Roman Empire on a scale that might be on par with the defeat of Adrianople in 378 or with the Battle of the Frigidus in 394. Phocas would almost ruin the Roman Empire, and his usurpation would create a war with Persia that would be the deadliest of all, completely weakening both the Roman and Persian Empire, which would then allow the Muslims to easily conquer the eastern provinces. Indeed, some historians even mark the death of Maurice as the end of classical antiquity, such as A.H.M. Jones, and I have to agree that this assessment makes sense, as I personally would also date late antiquity from around the year 300 until the early 600s AD. And so Maurice joined the long list of emperors who implemented the right and logical policies, but which were unpopular and led to their downfalls. This happened to Emperor Aurelian, this also happened to Emperor Majorian, and to many others. Maurice was a very good emperor, and had he not had the character flaw to misjudge other people around him, or to be too sure of his decisions, then he might have been a second Justinian, who could have restored the Roman Empire to the extent of Justinian or even more. And was his downfall avoidable? I think yes. Had he had more fine feeling for the state of the unhappiness of the army and of the population, he might have averted the mutiny of Phocas, and thus history would have gone very differently. He could have been ranked amongst the greatest Roman emperors of all time, but even so, despite his flaws, I think he still ranks amongst Rome's greatest emperors, and he is an emperor that is, in my opinion, too often neglected in history books. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via a YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. This channel would not work without our amazing and wonderful Patreon and YouTube members, and I would especially like to thank our new Kaiser supporter, Justinien Legrand. Thank you so much, Justinien Legrand, for supporting this channel in such a generous way. I cannot thank you enough. Merci beaucoup, monsieur. And I really want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form, be it Patreon, YouTube membership, PayPal donations, or by simply watching the videos. Gratias tibiago, amici. And if you want to learn more about the life of the great Emperor Majorian, who met a similar fate as Maurice, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about another very underrated emperor, namely Anthemius, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago, and bene valete.